In this video, we will show you how to replace your rear backing plate on the Chevy Silverado. This will be located behind your rear wheel. A quick note, when replacing the backing plate, you will have to remove your rear axle. With that said, you're going to have gear oil for the rear differential, and go ahead and replace the axle seal at the same time. Any work that's performed on one side of the vehicle is always recommended to be done on the opposite side of the vehicle. It doesn't make any sense to have new parts on one side of your vehicle and old parts on the other. Let's get into it. Okay friend, let's get started on our job. Safely raise and support the rear of the vehicle and remove your center cover. To remove the center cover, we'll be using a 22mm. A quick inspection of the cover, set it aside. Behind that, you'll find that you have 6 22mm lug nuts. Remove all 6 of those lug nuts and then the wheel. Looking at these brakes, it looks as though they need to be replaced, but I'm going to completely disassemble the brake caliper so I can confirm that it does not also need calipers. Some people might remove the caliper by only removing the bracket and the caliper as an assembly and setting it aside. It's best to give it a thorough inspection. With the wheel out of the way, the next thing we have to do is have a collection receptacle handy. We're going to make our way along the back side of the caliper to loosen our 10mm headed bleeder screw. Okay, along the back side here. Got my collection receptacle, 10mm wrench. Get this on there. The first thing we'll do is open up the bleeder screw and make sure we see a steady trickle of fluid coming out. If you don't see any fluid coming out, you might have an issue with the caliper or even the flex hose. All right, I definitely have some fluid. Nice. All right, let's get this on there. For these particular calipers, you have to come in from the edge and grab onto the ear and just gently pry up against the bracket. We just want to push in the caliper piston as much as possible doing this. Once we have the caliper off, we can give it a better inspection. All right. We'll snug up the bleeder screw and remove our collection receptacle. Now we can move along to removing our 2 13mm headed caliper bracket mounting bolts. Once you have the first bolt out of there, just give it a close inspection. Make sure it is still reusable. I typically like to start it in, back a couple threads, and then continue by fully removing the second mounting bolt. There we are. Take hold of the caliper, remove it, give it a close inspection. It's a good idea to continue pushing back the piston as far as possible. When you do so, also make sure you have the bleeder screw open. Continue on to removing your brake pads. These should pretty much just pull right out of here. Ours are stuck in the bracket. Just knock them out of there. Since we are replacing them, I can use a pry bar in this area. Otherwise, you want to be careful not to damage your friction material. We'll just give the brake pads a quick inspection. As you can tell, I damaged mine, but that's okay. I'm replacing them anyways. The next thing we'll do is remove our 2 18mm headed bolts that hold the caliper bracket in place. When you have the caliper bracket off of there, it's a good idea to go ahead and clean and inspect your 2 caliper slider ports. It's important to make sure these function properly. They should be able to spin and slide in and out of the bracket. We'll set this aside. Remove your brake rotor from the area. Let's move from out there towards the center of the differential. We'll be looking for our differential pan cover. Make sure you have a collection receptacle under this area. We'll clean up the area. You can use a wire brush. With that area cleaned down, we'll continue on to our 10, 13 millimeter headed mounting bolts that hold this pan in place. Starting along the top, we do have that area for the emergency brake bracket. Go ahead and remove the mounting bolt and set that bracket aside. As you remove the mounting bolts, give them a close inspection. We will be cleaning them, but for now, we'll just take this first bolt and start it back in a couple threads. Let's continue on with the removal process. If your differential pan's held in place with a gasket maker, you'll find that it's stuck in place. You're going to have to carefully separate this, being careful not to damage the pan or the differential. Let's carefully make our way in between this area. We have our collection bucket under here. Take hold of the differential pan. We'll remove our final mounting bolt. Remove the pan from the area. At this point, you need to clean and inspect the pan. Not only this inner portion here, we're paying attention to that magnet, which is typically full of debris. You want to make sure you don't see any large chunks of metal here. Some small chunks is pretty typical, but if you see large chunks, you could have internal differential damage. With the cover taken out of the way, we can focus on the center area here. We're going to have the vehicle in neutral so we can spin the drive shaft and gain access to the mounting point here. I'll reach along the front, take hold of the drive shaft yoke, and we'll carefully start twisting this. Here's what we're looking for. At this point, we have access to our 8 millimeter headed mounting bolt. For this one, we're going to loosen it, and we'll have to start pulling it out towards the passenger side. When we do remove that bolt, you'll find that it's a nice long bolt, and it comes through this pin right here. When you remove the bolt, the pin will want to slide out. Make sure it does not fall down and potentially get damaged. We'll give that a close inspection and set it aside temporarily. There we are. Start sliding that out while we hold the larger pin. A close inspection of this bolt, if it looks like it's rotted or damaged in any way, which is uncommon, you have to go ahead and replace it. Go ahead and clean it up and set it aside. We'll continue on with the center pin here. For this one, I'm just going to reach up along the top and carefully start helping it out diagonally down and out this hole. Once again, we're making sure that it does not fall and potentially get damaged. Go ahead and clean that up, a quick inspection, and set it aside as well. At this point, if you do spin the differential yoke, be careful not to offset the differential gears internally. We'll spin this just enough that we can have a close peek inside. Inside this area, there should be a small C or a U looking clamp. To remove that clip, you'd make your way to the outside of the axle, gently push it in towards the center of the vehicle, and that clip should dislodge and make its way to the bottom of the differential. Once it's out, once again, clean and inspect and set it aside. With the axle pushed in, we have a clear view of our internal clip here. Now for this particular type of differential, the clip itself will have to be taken out through this port. We can't push it through the other end, so we'll just go ahead and turn this until we can't see the small gap, and we can use a magnet to pull it out of place. Just have to spin it as needed until it's ready. There's our clip. Let's make sure we have a collection bucket under this area. Before we start pulling the axle out of place, it's important to make sure you clean up the area behind there where the seal is. We don't want any miscellaneous debris making its way into the differential. Let's take hold of the axle and carefully start pulling it out. Keep in mind, it could be heavy. We'll set this aside for recycling. With the axle out of the way, we'll continue on with removing our emergency brake shoe. You'll find this is held in place with one 5/16 mounting bolt. Pull that out of there. Remove your small bracket. At this point, you should be able to take hold of your emergency brake shoe, pivot it away, and slide it up and off of here. As you can tell, ours does need to be replaced because it does have gear oil on the friction material. I'll be replacing it with a brand new one. With the emergency brake shoe out of the way, we'll continue on with the adjustment point here. For this, you can just use a small prying device. Go ahead and gently pry this out of place. You'd want to make sure that you disassemble this, clean it, and inspect it, set it aside. We're going to have to re-lubricate it once everything's put back together here. We'll slide out the opposite side. Typically on this side, you're going to find a small tab that's still held in place. You can go ahead and pull that out, clean up the entire thing, and set it aside. Let's make our way along the back side of the backing plate here. We have our emergency brake cable, and we have the actuating lever. You can go ahead and pull both of them right out through the back side of the backing plate. If you find that any of the boot is still attached to that lever, go ahead and set that aside. We're going to continue on by removing the rest of the emergency brake cable from the bracket. To easily do this, we'll use an emergency brake cable release tool and a small prying device once again. I'm going to pry the spring away from the bracket, and then we can get our tool in place, squeezing in on those locking ears. I want to be careful not to damage the emergency brake cable because we will be reusing that. At this point, we'll slide the cable straight rearward and then bring it out through the center slot here. A quick inspection and set that aside temporarily. If this is stuck, use some penetrant. You can remove the tool from the area. With that out of the way, we'll continue on to the 13mm headed mounting bolt that holds the bracket, which holds your brake line and flex hose in place. Let's make our way out here. Along the outside here, we have a couple of tabs that are attached to the backing plate itself. You just want to carefully peen those away from the bracket. We'll continue on with removing our 4 18mm headed bolts that hold the bracket in place. The bolt's out of there. We should be able to take hold of this, give it a wiggle to pull it away. You may have to use a small prying device for this. Slide that right on out of the backing plate. Go ahead and clean this up, give it a close inspection, and set it aside. Along the backside, you do have a boot. You will replace this. You'll find that that boot came with the backing plate. Go ahead and pull that right off of there. At this point, twist up a rag and carefully put it inside of the differential seal here. We want to protect anything from making its way inside, and we'll continue on with removing the backing plate. As you can tell, our backing plate is extremely rotted. It's more than likely going to come out in pieces. If it's stuck in place, you could lightly tap it with a hammer or even pry it out of place. There it is, friend. Use a wire brush to clean up the mounting area here. We want to give that a close inspection, make sure it's a smooth mounting surface with no raised areas. We'll continue on with some anti-seize along the area that we just cleaned. We don't necessarily have to have any anti-seize inside of the bolt holes because when we go to remount the bracket, it's a good idea to have some thread locker on those mounting bolts. Use a glove finger for this. Let's clean up this bracket. Make sure you have a smooth mating surface here. We'll also make sure we clean the port where the boot and the actuator lever go through. Double check to make sure you have no miscellaneous debris inside this port. We'll look at it along the front side as well. It's important to make sure that you remove everything from inside this area and then re-lubricate it. Let's install our backing plate. Make sure you have it in the proper position so that the hollowed out area is facing towards the front of the vehicle. With the backing plate rested in place, we'll continue on with the bracket. We've already cleaned the port. Looking along the backside, we will want to make sure that we reinstall the boot. Now, if you were to look at the boot itself, looking in the center there, you can see a rectangular notch. We want to make sure we have that rectangular notch closest to this larger port. So with that said, we'll add a little bit of lubricant inside of this area, continue on to the boot, making sure we have it in the proper placement, and then we can take this entire thing and slide it in place on the backing plate and rear differential housing. Get some high temperature lubricant here. Take that boot, slide it right on there. Make sure it's bottomed out against the plate. Now we'll take this and put it in place, aligning it with its mounting points here. Carefully slide it right on through the bracket. Carefully slide the bracket through the backing plate. To try to get this lined up. Now, before you go too much further here with the mounting bolts, just take a quick peek along the backside to ensure that the boot is in the proper placement. If it isn't, continue on by removing the bracket, reinstalling the boot, and then reinstalling the bracket. Once again, a quick check to confirm, and then you can continue on with your mounting bolts. For the mounting bolts, we've cleaned the threads and added some blue thread locker. With each one of those mounting bolts started in, continue on to snugging them up and then torque each of those to 45 foot-pounds. The next thing we have to pay attention, there's two tabs on this backing plate that we have to peen over the bracket. If you were to forget about those, you're going to hear a scraping noise while you're driving down the road. There's one over here, you remember that we had peened it away on the original? The other one is on the opposite side of the backing plate here. For these, you can either take your finger or a small hammer and punch and just go ahead and drive them down into the locked position. Double check to make sure the backing plate is completely secured. We'll continue in this point. We'll use our high temperature lubricant directly inside the port, along the rearward side here, and along the forward side. Make sure there's plenty in there. With this area lubricated, we'll continue on along the back side of the backing plate here. We need to reinstall our emergency brake cable with actuator lever. Now, to install this emergency brake cable, we'll be starting up with the bracket area. On the cable itself, you remember that it did have the springed portion. We need to carefully pull that spring down far enough that we can slide the cable area through the slot on the bracket. Let's make sure we have the cable aligned. Now that we have the cable slid through there, we need to confirm that we do have this bottomed out against the bracket. Go ahead and take hold of that cable, give it a tug. If it falls out of there, it's not locked in properly. Let's continue following the cable down now to that actuator lever. That will go in through the back side of the boot and then come out through the outboard side here. We'll add some lubricant to this. That'll help keep rust off of there. Let's get this in there. Perfect. In this same area, we'll continue on with our brake line, brake hose bracket. Start in your 13mm headed bolt and go ahead and snug it up. Double check to make sure that's secured. Now we can make our way on the outside here. In this area, we'll continue on with our adjustment cog. We want to make sure that we do have the threaded portion cleaned up. And you can tell I added some anti-seize. We'll take these two pieces and screw them together as far as possible here. We don't need to tighten them up, just keep it loose. There we are. Continue on with a little bit of lubricant along the shafted area. You don't need much because you've already lubricated inside of the mounting port. We'll take the area with the adjustment cog and we'll slide it straight on down through the rearward portion of the bracket. Press that in as far as you can and we'll continue on along the forward side. For the forward side, you want to make sure that you disassemble this, clean it, and inspect it. There should be a small pin that can easily be removed, cleaned, and then we're going to re-lubricate everything. Go ahead and take that high temperature lubricant and add a good amount right inside this area. We want to prevent any type of rust, otherwise you're going to have an issue. Continue on to taking this and putting it in place. Should slide right in there. Now it's time to remove the axle seal. To remove the axle seal, you could either use an axle seal removal tool or just use a pry bar. Whatever you do, be extremely careful not to cause any damage to your differential. Pry bar is pretty handy for this. Just be careful, there could be gear oil in this area. We'll just give that seal a quick inspection and go ahead and set that aside. To install the seal, it's important to make sure that you lubricate the entire rubber area. We only need a thin amount here. I've got some on the outer portion and on the inner portion. It's extremely important on the inner portion though, because that's where you will find a small spring that makes its way all the way around. You want to make sure when you install the seal, the spring does not get dislodged. The next thing we need to talk about is the outer diameter of the seal itself, the area that presses into the differential. You'll find that the seal does not have any sealant on it. You're going to have to use a gasket maker, and when you do use gasket maker, make sure that it is oil resistant. That's extremely important. For the gasket maker, we'll just take a tiny bit, put it right in place here, and then we can spread it out with our gloved finger. Just make our way all the way around, and we can prepare for installation. To install this in the differential, you want to make sure you have it as level as possible with the end of the differential tube and then drive it into place. When you do so, only drive it against the outer portion, never against the inner portion. That will damage the seal. Once again, you're going to have to replace it. We'll be using a larger driver this time. Okay, you can hear an audible difference in that as well. A quick inspection and clean up your mess. Continue on inside this port with the manufacturer's specified gear oil. We only need to add enough that we can lubricate the bearing located behind there. We'll just work it around with a gloved finger. Make sure everything's well lubricated. Let's continue on with a little bit of high temperature caliper lubricant here. We'll make our way just along this tab, just above the bolt hole. And now we can continue on with our emergency brake shoe. To install your emergency brake shoe, we'll be paying attention down at the bottom where the two ears are. We need to make sure that those ears fit into the slots on the actuator here. Once we've done so, we'll swing this over and reinstall the bracket up along the top area. Slide the two ears along this area. You might have to stretch this gently. Just be careful not to pinch yourself. Should slide right in there. Let's pivot this up into the upright position. Continue on with the bracket. For the bracket, let's make sure we have it in the proper positioning here. Start in the mounting bolt and snug it up. Keep in mind this is a very small bolt and you don't want to break it. Okay, right there is bottomed out. Let's take it a tiny bit further. Double check to make sure your emergency brake shoe is secured properly. Okay, let's slide our axle shaft into position. As you bring it into position, be extremely careful around that seal. We do not want to cause any damage. We'll press this in as far as possible and make our way all the way to the center pumpkin of the differential. In the center here, we'll make sure that we reinstall our U-shaped clip. Make sure that it fits in the groove on the end of the axle. The axle does have to be pushed in as far as possible. Once you have that in position, make your way back outboard and tug on the axle. We'll be looking in here at the same time and make sure that the clip and the end of the axle make their way into the gear. Now if you're doing the other side of the vehicle, now's the time to do it before you continue putting the rest of the differential together. Now it's time for our pin. We'll pay attention to the side that has that mounting bolt hole. We need to make sure we have it through the mounting hole that makes its way through this area. There we are. Try to have it aligned here. We'll continue on with our mounting bolt. For this, I cleaned the threads and applied a very small amount of blue thread locker. Never use red thread locker on this application. We'll slide the bolt right on in here. If it does not align, you may have to lower the pin down and twist it a little bit. Start in that mounting bolt by hand so you're sure you are not cross-threading it. Snug it up. The torque for this is 27 foot-pounds. If you have a hard time getting a torque wrench in here, just make sure it's nice and snug. At this point, you can rotate the drive shaft yoke as necessary so you can gain access to this mounting bolt. Just gives us a little bit more room here. Swing our wrench. Right there is bottomed out. Just give it a little tap with a rubber mallet here. We don't want to cause any damage, but we do want to make sure it's tight, otherwise the bolt might come out and so could the pin, and that could be catastrophic to your differential. We'll continue on to cleaning up the mounting point on the differential itself, where the oil pan will rest up against. Before you start scraping anything down, we want to ensure that nothing falls inside the differential on the gears, or worse, on any of the bearings. Go ahead and cover the area. Let's put this in there. You can use whatever you have to here. Now to clean this area, you never want to use a sanding disc. That miscellaneous debris is going to make its way inside the differential and be dangerous. You could use a scraper for this and just remove as much of the excess debris along the outside portion as possible. After removing as much debris along the outer aspect as possible, continue on to removing the protective cloth across the outer portion here. And now we'll continue on by wiping down as much as we can see and make our way inside here to give this a quick wipe as well. You'll find that it could still have gear oil. Once you have the inner portion wiped down as much as possible, we'll continue on with a rag and some parts cleaner directly on that. Wipe down the outer mating surface here, give it a close inspection, make sure you don't have any oily residue. The next thing we'll do is prepare our cleaned differential pan. Looking at the inside here, you can tell that I cleaned down the entire area where the gasket will be, and I removed the magnet. Give that a quick wipe, and now I'm going to reinstall it into its original position. The next thing that you'll have to do is apply a gasket. Whether it's a gasket itself or some gasket maker, if you're using gasket maker, you do want to make sure you spread a thin layer all the way around, and then we'll take this and put it in place against the differential. At this point, I have my gasket maker on here. I'm going to spread it out with my glove finger as I had mentioned. We just need a thin bead that makes its way all the way around. It has to make a seal, keep moisture out, and the gear lube in. Of course, you can make this as pretty as you need to, but realistically, it just has to seal. We'll get the differential pan in place, start in all of the mounting bolts. Keep in mind, the top bolt does have that emergency brake bracket as well. Okay, let's snug them up and then we'll torque these to 30 foot-pounds. With the bolts snug down, we'll torque these to 30 foot-pounds. If you need to, you can go around one more time just to double check the torque. Once you've done that, let's make our way along the passenger side front of the differential now so we can fill the differential fluid. We're looking in this area for our fill plug. We can use a 3/8 drive ratchet with a short extension and remove the fill plug. A quick inspection and we'll set that aside. Now, when you remove the plug, it's a good idea to make sure you give it a thorough inspection. We'll set this aside temporarily. With the plug out of there, we'll continue filling the differential with the manufacturer's specified fluid. The way you can tell this is full is by adding, and once you get a steady trickle of fluid coming out of this area, it's as full as it needs to be. We'll continue on by cleaning up our mess and reinstalling the fill plug. Okay, we got some fluid coming out. We'll just make sure that it's not just runoff. Now that we're sure that's full, we'll continue on with our plug. Go ahead and start this in by hand, and then we'll snug it up. Okay, right there, it feels as though it bottomed out. We're not going to add too much pressure here. We just want to take it a little bit further. We'll clean up our mess here, and we'll make our way back to the end of that differential tube. Before you continue on putting on your brake rotor, it's important to make sure that you have a clean mating surface on the end of the axle here. You could use a wire brush if necessary. Let's coat the mating surface with some anti-seize. The next thing we'll do is reinstall the rotor. I'm replacing my rotor, but if you're not, you need to pay attention to the back side of the rotor where the mating surface is. Go ahead and clean that up until it's a smooth surface, and then you can continue on with the installation. When you go to slide the rotor on there, we're going to feel if you feel any resistance from the parking brake shoe. If it does not want to slide on, you may have to de-adjust this. You can do that by turning the small cog one direction or the other. If it feels as though there's no resistance and you try to spin the rotor and you don't hear any drag at all, you may have to adjust this out a little bit, basically bringing each end of the shoe out a tiny bit closer to the rotor. You want to make sure that you don't have too much friction because friction causes heat, that'll cause things to expand, and you can lock up your brakes. For this, you could use some pliers or a small prying device. You can just turn it one way or the other. Let's install the brake rotor here. I can still move this. It doesn't feel like there's too much resistance. I feel as though it's adjusted perfectly. Let's continue on to our caliper bracket. When installing the bracket, it's always a good idea to make sure that you clean and inspect the areas where your tins are and lubricate each one of your slider pins so everything moves properly. Let's take this, put it in place, and we'll start in each of our two caliper bracket bolts. For these, I'm using some blue thread locker. Start them in, snug them up, torque them to 148 foot-pounds. Time to install your brake pads. Make sure you put them in the proper positioning here. When you slide them into position, they should slide right in. If you have to use a hammer or pry them in, more than likely the bracket isn't cleaned up enough. With them in place, we'll just wiggle them around, make sure there is movement. Before installing the caliper on here, we're going to use some high temperature lubricant, lubricate along the piston and the backside of these two ears. Only in the areas that actually touch up against the pads. This will help with vibration dampening and noise reduction overall. Slide the caliper in place. Start in each of your two caliper slider bolts. Once you have them started in, you can snug them up and then torque those to 31 foot-pounds. One last quick inspection in this area to confirm that we did install and torque everything as necessary, and we can continue on with installing the wheel. Start on all 6 of your 22mm lug nuts, we'll bottom these out. Get the wheel safely back down on the ground and torque each of these to 140 foot-pounds. With the wheel safely back down on the ground, let's torque these in a crisscross manner. Torqued. If you have a center cover, install that now. To install your center cover, looking along the backside, you'll find that you have all 6 of these plastic caps. Those caps sit on top of the lug nuts. When you're installing the caps, just go ahead and do that by hand. You don't want to use an impact tool because you could crack them and break them. Okay, friend, we've got our vehicle back together. At this point, hop in the passenger compartment, pump up the brake pedal till it's nice and firm. After that, you want to test the parking brake functionality. Make sure it holds. Continue on to taking your vehicle for a road test, come back and check for leaks. Thanks for watching.
When only the best will do, demand TRQ. The only company that lets you view before you do. TRQ is committed to offering the highest quality aftermarket auto parts that are engineered for peace of mind. Thanks for using and viewing with TRQ.